My name is Eleanor Vance. I am 72 years old, and for 45 of those years, I believed I had raised a daughter who shared my soul. But as I sat in the sterile, dimly lit waiting room of a downtown clinic, clutching a tattered magazine I wasn't reading, my phone vibrated with a cold finality that would change my world forever. It was my daughter, Cassandra. When I answered, there was no "Hello, Mom," no inquiry about my health or the heart medication I was there to refill. Her voice was a sharp blade, frozen and distant. "Mom," she said, her tone devoid of even a flicker of hesitation, "we're leaving for London tomorrow morning. I've already finalized the sale of the lake house and your sedan. Mark and I needed the liquidity for a new venture. Don't try to call back. We'll be out of touch for a while. Goodbye." The line went dead before I could even draw a breath. The silence that followed was louder than any scream. I sat there, surrounded by the quiet coughs of strangers and the hum of a cheap air conditioner, feeling the weight of 45 years of sacrifice crumbling into ash. I had worked 2 jobs to put Cassandra through the best private schools. I had spent my retirement savings on her wedding to Mark, a man who looked at me as if I were a smudge on his expensive Italian shoes. And now, 6 months after losing my beloved husband, Arthur, to a sudden pulmonary embolism, my only child had stripped me of my home and my mobility while I was waiting to see a doctor. She had discarded me like a piece of broken furniture left on a curb. But as I stared at my reflection in the darkened phone screen, I didn't cry. Instead, a slow, burning heat began to glow in the pit of my stomach. Cassandra thought she knew me. She thought I was a fragile old woman who lived on memories and social security checks. She thought she had left me with nothing but the clothes on my back and a 30% pittance of a sale price she'd likely lie about later. What my daughter didn't know was that Arthur Vance was a man of deep secrets and meticulous foresight. And I was about to open a door that he had kept locked for decades, a door that would turn my daughter's victory into the greatest mistake of her life. Arthur had been a quiet man, a humble librarian who spent his weekends fixing old clocks and tending to our modest garden. Or so I thought. 3 nights before he collapsed at the breakfast table while pouring my orange juice, he had pulled a heavy, wax-sealed manila envelope from beneath the floorboards of our closet. His eyes had been unusually bright that night, filled with a sort of urgent tenderness. "Eleanor," he had whispered, pressing my hands over the rough paper, "if the world ever feels too small, or if the people you trust prove to be less than they seem, open this. But only when you are truly alone, and only when you feel the ground has slipped from beneath your feet." At the time, I thought he was being poetic, perhaps sensing his own mortality. I had tucked the envelope into the bottom of my cedar chest, buried under layers of winter quilts and grief. In the months following his funeral, Cassandra had been a constant shadow in my life. She was there every 2 days, helping me organize my finances, taking me to the grocery store, and whispering about how the lake house was too much maintenance for a woman of my age. I thought it was love. I thought her husband Mark, with his constant talk of market shifts and investment portfolios, was truly trying to secure my future. I had signed papers she put in front of me while my eyes were blurred with tears, trusting the blood in my veins over the logic in my head. Now, sitting in that plastic chair, the truth tasted like copper in my mouth. They hadn't been helping me, they had been harvesting me. They waited until I was at my weakest to pluck the final fruits of my labor. The lake house, the place where Arthur and I had watched every sunrise for 30 years, was gone. The car, a vintage silver Cadillac that Arthur had restored with his own hands, was sold. I was effectively homeless and stranded. "Mrs. Vance, the doctor is ready for you," the nurse called out. I stood up, but I didn't walk toward the exam room. I walked toward the exit. My health was fine. It was my life that needed an intervention. I stepped out into the humid afternoon air and realized I didn't even have a ride home. I had to wait 40 minutes for a city bus, sitting on a bench among teenagers and commuters who didn't see the rich woman hiding inside the grandmotherly silhouette. As the bus jolted through the streets of our city, I watched the familiar landmarks pass by. The park where Cassandra had learned to ride a bike, the bakery where we bought her graduation cake. It all felt like a movie I had watched a long time ago, one with a very sad ending. When I finally arrived at the small suburban house Arthur and I had kept as our primary residence, I felt a sense of urgency I hadn't felt in years. I bypassed the kitchen, ignored the blinking light on the answering machine, and went straight to the bedroom. I knelt by the cedar chest, my joints complaining, and tossed aside the quilts until my fingers brushed the coarse surface of the manila envelope. My hands shook as I broke the wax seal. I expected a few life insurance policies or perhaps a hidden savings account. What I found inside made my heart stop. There were deeds to 4 commercial properties in the heart of the downtown district. There were titles to a luxury apartment complex 3 towns over. The very complex, I realized with a jolt, where Cassandra and Mark had been renting a penthouse they claimed they struggled to afford. There were certificates for gold bullion held in a private vault and a ledger of investments that dated back 30 years. But most precious of all was a letter, written in Arthur's neat, cramped handwriting. "My dearest Eleanor," it began, "if you are reading this, the mask has likely fallen. I spent my life as a librarian because I loved the peace of books, but I spent my mind building a fortress for you. I never told Cassandra about the extent of our wealth because I saw the shadow of greed growing in her husband, and I feared it was contagious. I wanted her to love us for the crumbs, so that one day she might deserve the feast. If she has failed you, Eleanor, do not be cruel, but be firm. You are the owner of everything they desire. Use this power to teach her what it means to truly lose everything." I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, the shadows of the room lengthening as the sun dipped below the horizon. I looked at the ledger. The numbers were staggering. Arthur hadn't just saved, he had built an empire in silence. I wasn't just a widow in a wine-colored dress. I was one of the wealthiest women in the state. And my daughter, currently packing her bags for a lavish trip to London with money she stole from my meager assets, had no idea that she was essentially a tenant in a world I now owned. I picked up the phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in years, Arthur's old friend and attorney, Silas Thorne. He answered on the second ring, his voice gravelly and sharp. "Eleanor, I've been waiting for this call for 6 months, Silas said, skipping the pleasantries. "Arthur told me you'd find the envelope when the time was right. I assume the time is now." "The time is now, Silas," I said, my voice steadier than it had been since the day of the funeral. "My daughter has sold the lake house and the car. She thinks I'm finished. I need you to pull every file, every deed, and every cent under the Vance name. I want a full audit of my daughter's husband's business, and I want the keys to every property I own, especially the one they live in." "Consider it done," Silas replied. "And Eleanor, Arthur always said you were the smarter one. Don't let your heart get in the way of justice." "My heart is fine, Silas," I whispered, looking at the photo of Arthur on my nightstand. "It's just finally open." That night, for the first time in a long time, I didn't dream of the hospital or the funeral. I dreamed of the lake. I dreamed of the water being calm before a great storm. I knew that tomorrow, Cassandra would be flying over the Atlantic, dreaming of her new life in London, fueled by the betrayal of her mother. She thought she had won. She thought she had outplayed the old woman. But as I closed my eyes, I knew that the flight back would be much, much longer. She had taken my car and my house, but I was about to take her reality. The sun had not yet risen when I heard the heavy thud of a suitcase hitting the floor in the hallway. I stayed perfectly still in my bed, listening to the muffled whispers of Cassandra and Mark. They were leaving for the airport 3 hours earlier than they had told me. They weren't just leaving, they were escaping. They didn't want to see my face, didn't want to deal with the messy reality of the tears they expected me to shed. I heard the front door click shut, the engine of a waiting car purr to life, and then silence. The house felt cavernous, a hollow shell of 45 years of memories. I rose slowly, my joints stiff but my mind sharper than a diamond. I didn't go to the window to wave goodbye to a daughter who had essentially robbed me. Instead, I went to the kitchen and brewed a pot of black coffee, the steam rising in the quiet morning air. I had work to do. By 8:00 a.m., I was sitting in the back of a black town car that Silas Thorne had sent for me. As we drove toward his downtown office, I watched the city wake up. It was a strange sensation to look at buildings and storefronts and realize that, on paper, I held the keys to so many of them. Silas's office was located in a pre-war building with high ceilings and mahogany bookshelves that smelled of old paper and expensive tobacco. He was standing by the window, a tall, thin man with silver hair and eyes that missed nothing. He didn't offer me tea or platitudes. He simply pointed to a stack of leather-bound folders on his desk. "Arthur was a ghost, Eleanor," Silas said, his voice filled with a begrudging respect. "He moved money through shell companies and trusts so quietly that even the IRS had to squint to see him. But it was all legal, all taxed, all yours. You aren't just comfortable, you are formidable. You own the Riverside Heights complex, the one where your daughter has her penthouse. You own the deed to the Mercer Plaza downtown. You even own a 40% stake in the logistics firm where Mark is a junior partner. The irony is staggering. Mark has been trying to climb a corporate ladder that you effectively own the rungs to." I traced the gold lettering on one of the folders. "And the lake house, Silas, the one they sold yesterday." Silas smiled, a thin, predatory expression. "That's where they got sloppy. Cassandra used a limited power of attorney you signed during your period of mourning. It gave her the right to manage your affairs, but not to liquidate primary assets without a secondary signature, which she forged. Because I am the primary trustee of the Vance estate, any sale of property tied to the trust is technically void without my authorization. The buyers are a shell company I also happen to represent. I've frozen the funds. The house is still yours. The car is sitting in a private garage 3 blocks from here. They haven't made a penny, Eleanor. They've only committed a felony." A wave of relief washed over me, but it was quickly replaced by a cold, hard resolve. "I don't want them in jail, Silas. Not yet. If they go to jail now, they become victims in their own minds. I want them to feel the weight of their choices. I want Cassandra to understand that the poverty she tried to force on me is a very real, very cold place. What do you propose?" Silas asked, leaning back. "They think they are in London for 6 months to start a venture," I said. "Let them stay there. Let them spend whatever savings they have left. In the meantime, I want to take control of Riverside Heights. I want the management company to send out a notice, not just to the tenants, but specifically to the penthouse occupants. Mark has been using his influence at the firm to skip rent payments, hasn't he?" Silas nodded. "He's 6 months behind. He told the board his wealthy mother-in-law was covering it as an investment. They believed him because of the Vance name." "Good," I whispered. "Evict them, not today but in 30 days. Make it public, make it legal, and I want Mark's firm to start an internal audit. If he's willing to steal a lake house from a widow, imagine what he's doing with the company's books." For the next 3 weeks, I lived a double life. To my neighbors, I was Eleanor, the grieving widow who had been abandoned. I walked to the local market, I sat on my porch, and I accepted the sympathetic nods of people who thought I was penniless. Aurora, the gossip from 2 doors down, even brought over a casserole and asked if I needed help applying for government assistance. I thanked her with a dry smile, all the while knowing that my net worth could buy her entire block 10 times over. Every evening, Silas would call with updates. The audit at Mark's firm was uncovering irregularities. The eviction notice had been posted on the door of the penthouse, and in London, the venture was failing. Apparently, the London partners Mark had been bragging about were nothing more than high-end con artists who saw a desperate American couple with a forged power of attorney as easy prey. I spent my afternoons at the lake house. Silas had recovered the keys, and I sat on the deck, watching the water ripple under the autumn breeze. I could almost feel Arthur sitting next to me, his hand on my shoulder. I realized then that he hadn't kept the money a secret out of a lack of trust in me. He had kept it a secret to give me this moment, the moment where I could choose who I wanted to be without the shadow of his protection. Then, the phone rang. It was a London number. My heart hammered against my ribs as I saw Cassandra's name on the screen. I waited until the fourth ring before answering. "Mom!" Her voice was different. The ice was gone, replaced by a frantic, high-pitched desperation. "Hello, Cassandra," I said calmly. "How is London? I imagine the weather is quite gray this time of year." "Mom, listen to me," she sobbed, and I could hear the sound of traffic and sirens in the background. "Something went wrong. The investment. It's gone, Mark. He's in trouble. The people we were working with, they took everything. We're at a hotel and they're threatening to kick us out because our cards are being declined. Did you get the money from the house sale? I need you to wire it to me. Now, please." I took a slow sip of my tea, looking out at the lake that she had tried to steal from me. "The house sale, Cassandra? I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding. Silas Thorne called me. It seems the sale was never finalized. Legal issues," he said. "Something about a forged signature. The authorities are looking into it." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end. "What? No, that's impossible," Mark said. "Mark says a lot of things, dear," I interrupted. "He also told his firm that I was paying your rent at Riverside Heights. I received a notice in the mail today. You're being evicted, Cassandra. The management company is taking possession of the penthouse in 2 weeks. All your furniture, your designer clothes, your jewelry. It will all be seized to cover the back rent." "Mom, you can't be serious," she screamed. "Where are we supposed to go? We're coming back tomorrow. We have no money for a flight. We had to use Mark's secret credit card. You have to help us." "You're my mother. I was your mother when I was sitting in that doctor's office, too," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper. "I was your mother when you sold my car and left me at a bus stop. I was your mother for 45 years of sacrifice. But today, Cassandra, I'm just a woman who understands the value of an investment. And right now, you are a very poor one. Mom, please, we have nowhere else to go. Mark is. He's losing it. He's blaming me. He says it was my idea to sell your things." "I'm sure he does," I said. "You can come back, Cassandra. My door is always open to my daughter. But Mark, he's not welcome on my property. And as for your money, I suggest you find a way to earn some. I hear London has some lovely soup kitchens." I hung up. My hands were shaking, not with fear, but with a strange, intoxicating sense of power. I wasn't just surviving, I was rewriting the script. I walked into the house and looked at the clock Arthur had fixed just a week before he died. It was ticking perfectly. Every second was a step closer to the confrontation I had been preparing for. I knew they would be back. I knew they would crawl to my doorstep, expecting the same old Alina to open her arms and her checkbook. But the Alina they knew was buried in the cemetery next to Arthur. The woman waiting for them now was someone they hadn't even met. The following 48 hours were a masterclass in psychological warfare, though I never left the comfort of my armchair. Silas had alerted me the moment Cassandra and Mark touched down at JFK. They hadn't flown first class this time. They had arrived on a budget carrier, cramped and humiliated, with only 3 suitcases between them. They were fleeing the wreckage of their London dreams, unaware that the home they were returning to was no longer a sanctuary, but a cage of their own making. I sat in my living room, the house bathed in the amber glow of a single-floor lamp. I had intentionally left the porch light off. I wanted the house to look small, vulnerable, and ancient, exactly the way Cassandra perceived me. When the yellow cab finally pulled up to the curb, I watched through the slats of the Venetian blinds. Mark climbed out first, his expensive wool coat stained and his posture slumped. He looked like a man who had seen the bottom of a pit and realized he was still falling. Cassandra followed, her face a mask of exhaustion and tear-streaked mascara. They didn't ring the bell. They used their emergency key, stumbling into the foyer with the heavy breathing of people who had been running for too long. I didn't move. I stayed in the shadows of the wingback chair, watching as they dropped their bags. "Mom!" Cassandra whispered, her voice cracking. "Are you awake?" "I'm right here, Cassandra," I said. She jumped, clutching her chest. Mark let out a ragged sigh of relief, stepping forward as if he were still the master of the house. Eleanor, thank God, it's been a nightmare. We need to talk about the bank accounts. There's been some kind of massive clerical error. My firm is freezing my assets, and the apartment— I know all about the apartment, Mark, I said, standing up slowly. I walked into the light, and for the first time I didn't see a daughter and a son-in-law. I saw two predators who had finally run out of prey. And I know about the clerical error. It's called an audit. Silas Thorne tells me they found evidence of embezzlement. Something about you using company funds to hedge bets on that London venture. Mark's face went from pale to a sickly shade of gray. Silas Thorne? What does that old drunk know? Eleanor, you're being manipulated. You need to give us the keys to the lake house. We need to move in there tonight to avoid the process servers at the Penthouse. The lake house is occupied, Mark, I lied smoothly. I've rented it out. I needed the income since you were so kind as to sell my car and leave me with 30% of a pittance. Cassandra stepped forward, her hands shaking. Mom, please, we're sorry about the car. We were desperate. Mark said we'd make it all back in a week. We just need a place to stay, just for a few days until we sort this out. I looked at her, really looked at her. This was the girl I had stayed up with through fevers, the woman I had cheered for at every milestone. And she had sold my sanctuary for a chance to play at being high society in Europe. You can stay in your old room, Cassandra, I said, my voice cold. But Mark stays in a motel. There's a cheap one near the interstate. I believe they charge by the hour. Eleanor, you can't be serious. Mark barked, his old arrogance flickering for a second. I'm her husband. We're a family. Family doesn't sell their mother's home while she's at the doctor, I snapped, the fire finally breaking through my calm exterior. Family doesn't forge signatures on deeds. You have 10 minutes to take your things and leave this house, Mark. If you're still here in 11, I'll call the police and report the silver Cadillac as stolen. I believe the paper trail leads directly to your offshore account. The silence that followed was absolute. Mark looked at Cassandra, expecting her to defend him, to scream at me, to do something. But Cassandra was looking at the floor, the weight of her choices finally crushing her. She knew I wasn't bluffing. She knew the fragile Eleanor was gone. Without a word, Mark grabbed his one remaining suitcase and slammed the door behind him. I heard him cursing on the porch, the sound of his footsteps fading as he walked toward the main road. He had no car, no money, and no allies. He was exactly where he had tried to leave me. Cassandra collapsed onto the sofa, sobbing into her hands. He's going to leave me, Mom. He's going to go to prison and leave me with nothing. You already have nothing, Cassandra, I said, sitting across from her. You traded your integrity for a man who would sell his own soul for a corner office. Now go upstairs, wash your face. Tomorrow we start a new routine. The next morning, the new routine began. I woke Cassandra at 6:00 a.m. She looked bewildered, her eyes swollen. What's happening? She groaned. You need a job, I said. And since you don't have a car, you'll be taking the bus. There's a diner 3 miles from here that needs a dishwasher. I've already called the owner, an old friend of Arthur S. He's expecting you at 7. A dishwasher? Mom, I have a degree in marketing. I can't work in a kitchen. You have a degree in marketing and a reputation for fraud, Cassandra. No firm in this city will touch you until the legal dust settles. You wanted liquidity. Now you'll earn it, one plate at a time. For the next week, I watched my daughter suffer. She came home with red, chapped hands and clothes that smelled of grease and old dishwater. She complained about her back, her feet, and the way the manager talked to her. I listened to every word with a nod, offering her nothing but a bowl of plain soup and a reminder that the bus left at 6:15 the next morning. I was waiting for her to break. I was waiting for the moment the princess died and the woman was born. But something else was happening, too. Silas was sending me daily reports on Mark. He was staying in a flea-ridden motel, trying to call his old contacts, but everyone had ghosted him. He was desperate, and a desperate man is a dangerous man. On Friday afternoon, while Cassandra was at work, Silas came to the house. He looked troubled. Eleanor, we have a problem, he said, spreading out a series of documents on the kitchen table. Mark didn't just embezzle from his firm. He took out a high-interest private loan from some less than reputable people. He used the Riverside Heights penthouse as collateral, claiming he owned the deed. Now that the eviction notice is public, those people are looking for their money, and they don't use process servers. They use crowbars. My heart skipped a beat. Is Cassandra in danger? Technically, her name is on the loan application as a cosigner. Mark forged that too, but to these people, a signature is a signature. They don't care about the why. They want the how much. I looked at the documents. The debt was significant, but to me, it was a drop in the bucket. I could pay it off with a single phone call. But if I did that now, I would be saving Cassandra from a fire she helped build. Where is Mark now? I asked. He disappeared from the motel this morning. My investigator lost him near the docks. A leaner, he's cornered. He might try something desperate. He still thinks you're poor. He still thinks the only way out is to force you to sign over the rest of your assets, the ones he thinks you're hiding. Let him come, I whispered. I've been waiting 45 years to see what my family is really made of. That evening, when Cassandra walked through the door, she looked different. She didn't complain about the diner. She sat at the table and looked at her hands. Mom, she said softly, I saw Mark today. He was waiting at the bus stop. I tensed. What did he want? He wanted me to steal your jewelry. He said if I gave him Dad's old watch and your engagement ring, he could get us out of the city. He said we could start over in Florida. And what did you say? Cassandra looked up at me, and for the first time in years, I saw my daughter's eyes, the real ones. I told him I'd rather wash dishes for the rest of my life than spend another minute breathing the same air as him. I told him to leave you alone. I felt a lump form in my throat, but I forced it down. And did he? He got angry, Mom, he said. He said you were hiding things. He said Dad wasn't just a librarian. He said he saw a manila envelope once in Mark's office that had the Vance name on properties he couldn't account for. He thinks you're rich, Mom. He thinks you've been lying to us. I leaned forward, the shadows of the kitchen making my face look like carved stone. I haven't been lying, Cassandra. I've been waiting. Your father and I built everything for you, but you didn't want to build, you wanted to burn. Now, tell me, if I told you that everything Mark suspected was true, if I told you that I could pay off every debt, stop every eviction, and put you in a position of power tomorrow, what would you do? Cassandra stared at me, the silence stretching between us like a tightrope. I'd tell you to keep it, she whispered. Because I don't deserve it, not yet. I stood up and walked to the window. In the distance, I saw the headlights of a car slowing down in front of the house. It wasn't a taxi. It was a black SUV with tinted windows. Well, Cassandra, I said, my voice as cold as the winter lake. It's a good thing you said that, because the people Mark owes money to just arrived, and I think it's time we showed them who really runs this town. The black SUV sat idling at the curb, its headlights cutting through the evening mist like the eyes of a predator. Cassandra stood up, her face draining of color as she followed my gaze. Mom, who is that? Is that Mark? She whispered, her voice trembling. No, Cassandra, I said, pulling her away from the window. That isn't Mark. Those are the consequences of Mark's greed. Stay in the kitchen. Do not come out until I tell you. I walked to the front door, my heart steady. I wasn't the trembling widow they expected. I opened the door before they could even step onto the porch. Two men in dark, expensive suits stepped out of the vehicle. They didn't look like thugs. They looked like bankers who enjoyed the sight of blood. The taller one, a man with a jagged scar across his eyebrow, held a folder. Mrs. Vance, he asked, his voice a smooth, terrifying baritone. We're looking for Mark Sterling, or more accurately, we're looking for the $500,000 he secured against a property he didn't own. We understand his wife is here. I stepped out onto the porch, closing the door behind me. I stood tall, the cold air biting at my skin. Mark Sterling is no longer a part of this household. As for the money, you're standing on my property. Any business you have with my son-in-law ends at the sidewalk. The man laughed, a dry, hollow sound. You've got spirit, lady, but we have a co-signer's signature. Cassandra Sterling. If Mark can't pay, she does, and if she can't pay, we start taking things. We hear there's a lake house, a silver Cadillac. The lake house belongs to me, I said, my voice dropping an octave. The Cadillac belongs to me, and the signature you have is a forgery. My attorney, Silas Thorne, has already filed the affidavits. If you step 1 foot on this grass, I'll have you arrested for trespassing. And if you attempt to harass my daughter, I'll buy the debt collection agency you work for and fire you both by lunch. The men exchanged a look. The shorter one stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. You're going to buy a multi-million-dollar firm? With what? Librarian pension? Look, lady, we don't want trouble, we just want the money. Then call your boss, I said, pulling a small business card from my pocket, the one Silas had given me with the private number of the Vance Trust. Tell him Eleanor Vance is holding the line. Tell him that if he wants to discuss the Sterling debt, he can meet me at my office at Mercer Plaza tomorrow morning. Until then, get off my street. I watched them. For a moment, I saw the calculation in their eyes. They weren't used to 71-year-old women barking orders, but there was something in my posture, something inherited from Arthur's quiet strength, that made them hesitate. The tall one took the card, glanced at it, and nodded slowly. Mercer Plaza, 9 a.m. Don't be late, Mrs. Vance. They got back into the SUV and drove away. I stayed on the porch until their taillights vanished. My hands were finally shaking, but not from fear, from the sheer adrenaline of taking back my life. When I went back inside, Cassandra was slumped against the kitchen counter, her head in her hands. They're gone, I said. They'll come back, Mom. Mark told me they were dangerous. He said he was scared of them. That's why he wanted to run. Mark is a coward, I said, sitting across from her. He runs because he has nothing to stand on. We aren't running. We're going to Mercer Plaza tomorrow. To do what? Mom, we don't have that kind of money. I looked at my daughter, the girl who had sold my car for a London vacation. I realized it was time to stop the charade. I went to the cedar chest, pulled out the manila envelope, and laid the ledger on the table. Read this, Cassandra. She frowned, picking up the heavy book. As she turned the pages, her eyes grew wider. She saw the properties, the stock portfolios, the gold reserves. She saw the name Arthur Vance at the top of every page and Eleanor Vance as the sole beneficiary. Mom. What is this? Is this a joke? It's your father's legacy, I said softly. Arthur wasn't just a librarian. He was a genius who saw the world for what it was, a series of numbers and risks. He built this for us. He kept it quiet because he wanted you to grow up with a sense of reality. He feared that if you knew how much we had, you'd become the person you were 3 weeks ago. Cassandra's face turned a deep shade of red. She looked at the numbers, then at me, then back at the ledger. You've had this the whole time, even when Mark was talking about the lake house, even when I sold the car. I found it the day you called me from the doctor's office, I said. The day you told me you sold my life out from under me. I was going to tell you, Cassandra. I was going to share everything. But then you showed me that to you, I was just an asset to be liquidated. So I decided to let you experience the life you were trying to give me. Cassandra started to cry, but these weren't the frantic tears of London. These were tears of deep, agonizing shame. I'm sorry. Mom, I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I was so caught up in Mark's world, in the idea of being someone. I thought you were just old. I thought I was doing what was best. Selling a widow's home is never best, Cassandra, I said firmly. But you've spent the last week washing dishes and taking the bus. You've felt the chapped skin and the exhaustion. You've seen what it's like to have no safety net. That is the most important lesson your father and I could ever give you. Money is a tool, not a soul. She nodded, her shoulders heaving. What happens now? Are you going to pay Mark's debt? I am going to settle the debt for the penthouse to protect my property, I said. But Mark has to face his own music. Silas has already handed over the evidence of his embezzlement to the district attorney. By tomorrow afternoon, there will be a warrant for his arrest. And me? That's up to you, I said. I own a lot of buildings, Cassandra. They need management. They need someone who understands marketing, but someone who also knows what it's like to scrub a floor. If you want a place in this family, you start at the bottom of the Vance Trust. You'll be an assistant property manager for the smallest building I own. You'll earn a modest salary. You'll pay back every cent you borrowed from the sale of my car and the lake house, and you will never, ever lie to me again. Cassandra looked at me, and for the first time in a decade, she smiled, not the plastic smile of a socialite, but the humble smile of a daughter. "I'll take the job, Mom. I'll take any job." The next morning, I arrived at Mercer Plaza. I was wearing the wine-colored dress Arthur loved, a string of real pearls, and a coat that cost more than Mark's annual salary. Silas was waiting for me in the lobby, looking impressed. "You look like a queen going to war, Alina," he chuckled. "No, Silas," I said, adjusting my gloves. "I'm just a mother finishing a lesson." We went up to the top floor. The men from the SUV were there, along with their boss, a man named Vinny who looked like he'd been carved out of granite. He sat behind a desk, looking smug until I sat down, and Silas laid a certified check for the full amount of the debt on the table. "This covers the sterling debt," Silas said. "In exchange, you will sign this release of all claims against Cassandra Sterling and the Riverside Heights property, and you will provide a statement to the police regarding Mark Sterling's fraudulent application." Vinny looked at the check, then at me. "Who are you?" "I'm the woman who owns the building your office is in," I said, leaning forward. "And your lease is up next month. If I ever see your men near my daughter or my home again, I won't just evict you. I'll buy the bank that holds your company's line of credit and shut you down." The room went silent. Vinny's smugness evaporated. He signed the papers with a shaking hand. As we walked out of the building, the sun was shining brightly. My phone buzzed. It was a text from the investigator. "Mark Sterling located at the bus terminal, arrested at 10:15 a.m. I took a deep breath of the crisp air. The betrayal was over. The debt was paid. But as I looked at Silas, I knew there was one more thing Arthur had left for me, the safety deposit box. "Silas," I said, "take me to the central bank. It's time to see what's in box 247. The central bank of the city was a fortress of granite and iron, a place where time seemed to stand still beneath the vaulted ceilings and the watchful eyes of silent security guards. As Silas and I walked through the heavy brass doors, the echoes of our footsteps felt like the ticking of a clock, counting down to a final revelation. I felt the weight of the small, tarnished key in my coat pocket, the key Arthur had hidden in a second, smaller envelope, the one Cassandra had found among Mark's stolen items. We were led down into the bowels of the building, through a series of reinforced gates, until we reached the quiet, chilled air of the vault room. The clerk, a man who looked as old as the bank itself, compared my signature with the one on file from 30 years ago. He nodded slowly, led us to a wall of numbered steel doors, and slid his master key into box 247. "I'll leave you to your privacy, Mrs. Vance," the clerk whispered, sliding the long metal box out and placing it on a small table in a private viewing booth. I sat down, my heart hammering against my ribs. Silas stood by the door, his hat in his hands. He knew this was a moment between a husband and a wife, a conversation across the veil of death. I pulled the lid open. I expected more deeds, perhaps more gold, or another ledger of hidden wealth. But the box was mostly empty. At the bottom lay a single, weathered leather-bound journal and a small, velvet-lined box. I opened the velvet box first. Inside was a simple, silver locket, the one I had lost on our 10th anniversary during a trip to the coast. I had cried for weeks, thinking it was buried under the sand of a distant beach. Arthur had told me he couldn't find it, but here it was, polished and gleaming, held in reserve for a day when I might need a reminder of what was truly lost and found. I picked up the journal. As I flipped through the pages, I realized it wasn't a record of money. It was a record of Cassandra. Arthur had been documenting her life, not just the milestones, but the shifts in her character. July 14th, Cassandra asked for a designer bag for her birthday. When I told her we couldn't afford it, she didn't speak to Alina for 3 days. The shadow is growing. October 22nd. Met Mark today. He talks about people as if they are chess pieces. I see how she looks at him, not with love, but with an appetite for the world he promises. I must protect a leaner. I must build a wall that even greed cannot climb. As I read, tears finally began to spill down my cheeks. Arthur hadn't just been saving money. He had been mourning the loss of his daughter's spirit long before she ever betrayed me. He had seen it coming. He had built this empire not out of a love for wealth, but as a survival kit for a woman he knew would one day be discarded by her own flesh and blood. In the back of the journal, there was a final entry, dated just a week before his death. Aliner, if you are at the bank, it means the wall has been hit. It means Cassandra has made her choice. But there is one thing she doesn't know. The Riverside Heights complex, the commercial buildings, they are not just investments, they are a test. In this box, beneath the velvet lining, you will find the final deed. It is the deed to the Vance Foundation. I have left half of the liquid assets to a trust that provides housing for abandoned seniors. If Cassandra has truly changed, let her run it. If she hasn't, let her watch from the sidewalk. I lifted the velvet lining of the box and found a thick, legal document. It was the charter for a non-profit foundation. Arthur had turned his secret wealth into a shield for people exactly like me, women who had been liquidated by their families. I walked out of the bank with a clarity that was almost frightening. I wasn't just going to manage properties. I was going to build a legacy that stood for everything Cassandra had tried to destroy. When I returned home, I found Cassandra in the kitchen. She had finished her shift at the diner and was sitting at the table, her hands soaked in a bowl of warm water and Epsom salts. She looked up as I entered, her eyes searching my face. "Did you find it, Mom?" "The treasure." I sat down across from her and placed the silver locket on the table. "I found something better than treasure, Cassandra. I found your father's heart." I told her about the journal. I told her about the foundation. I told her that her father had spent the last decade of his life watching her slip away, and that his final wish was to give her a chance to climb back. "He knew," she whispered, her voice breaking. "He knew I was becoming a monster." "He knew you were lost," I corrected. "And he knew that only the truth would bring you back. Now you have a choice. You can stay here, work your way up in the property management business, and eventually take over the foundation. You will spend your life helping the people you once thought were beneath you. Or I can give you a check for $50,000 right now, the last bit of liquidity you'll ever get from me, and you can walk out that door and find Mark." Cassandra looked at the locket, then at her chapped, red hands. She didn't hesitate. She pushed the locket toward me. "Keep the check, Mom. I want to work. I want to see the journal. I want to know what else he said about me." For the next 3 months, the Vance house transformed. Cassandra worked 10-hour days. She started as an assistant to Sela's, learning the legalities of the trust. In the evenings, she sat with me and we went through the properties. We visited the Riverside Heights complex, not to the penthouse, but to the ground floor units where we began converting empty spaces into a community center for the elderly. Mark's trial was a public spectacle. He tried to claim that I was the mastermind, that I had hidden the wealth to frame him. But Sela's thorn was a lion in the courtroom. He produced the forensic evidence of Mark's forgeries, the paper trail of his embezzlement, and the testimony of the men from the black SUV who were more than happy to turn on him to save their own skins. Mark was sentenced to 15 years in a federal penitentiary. On the day of his sentencing, Cassandra asked me to go with her to the prison. She wanted to see him one last time before the doors locked for good. I sat in the car as she went inside. When she came out 20 minutes later, she didn't look sad. She looked clean. "What did he say?" I asked as she climbed into the passenger seat. "He asked me if the old lady had any more money hidden in the walls," she said, bucking her seatbelt. "He told me he'd be out in 5 if I hired a better lawyer. I told him he was lucky I didn't hire the one who'd keep him there for 20. We drove toward the lake house. It was spring now, and the trees were beginning to bud with a vibrant, defiant green. The silver Cadillac was parked in the driveway, gleaming under the afternoon sun. Silas had even found the original mechanic who had helped Arthur restore it to ensure it ran perfectly. As we sat on the deck, looking out over the water where the sunset was painting the sky in shades of violet and gold, Cassandra turned to me. "Mom, why didn't you just tell me? Why didn't you stop me before I sold the car? You could have saved yourself so much pain." I looked at the water, thinking of Arthur. "Because, Cassandra, if I had stopped you, you would have stayed the person who wanted to sell it. You had to follow your path to the end so you could see where it led. You had to lose everything to realize that everything was standing right in front of you." I reached into my pocket and pulled out the silver locket. I leaned over and clipped it around her neck. "Your father found this 40 years ago. He kept it for a day when we were both ready to remember who we are. I think today is that day." The silence between us was no longer heavy or filled with secrets. It was a peaceful silence, the kind that only comes after a long war has ended and the rebuilding has begun. But just as I was about to suggest we go inside and start dinner, my phone rang. It was an unknown number from a local hospital. "Eleanor Vance," a voice asked. "This is the ICU at St. Jude S. We have a patient here, a Mark Sterling. He was involved in a violent altercation during transport to the correctional facility. He's listed you as his emergency contact." I looked at Cassandra. She saw the change in my expression immediately. "Is it him?" she whispered. I didn't answer right away. I looked at the lake, at the house Arthur had built, at the life I had reclaimed. The past was clawing at the door again, refusing to stay buried. Mark was a monster, but he was also the man my daughter had once loved, and he was currently dying in a hospital bed. "Yes," I said to the nurse. "I'll be there, but I'm bringing my lawyer." I hung up and looked at my daughter. "The lesson isn't over yet, Cassandra. It seems Mark has one final thing to teach us about the cost of a life ill-lived." We got into the Cadillac. As the engine roared to life, a sound that felt like Arthur's laughter, I knew that whatever happened at that hospital, the Vances were no longer victims. We were the ones who decided how the story ended. The drive to St. Jude's Hospital was a journey through a landscape of ghosts. Cassandra sat in the passenger seat of the Cadillac, her fingers nervously tracing the cool metal of the silver locket. Outside, the city lights blurred into long, rhythmic streaks of neon and shadows. We didn't speak. The hum of the engine, the same engine Arthur had painstakingly tuned, was the only thing filling the void. I could feel Cassandra's internal struggle, the battle between the woman she was becoming and the ghost of the love she had once wasted on a man who had tried to erase her mother. When we stepped into the ICU, the atmosphere changed instantly. The air was thick with the smell of antiseptic and the rhythmic, mechanical wheezing of ventilators. Silas Thorne was already there, leaning against a white-tiled wall, looking as immovable as an old oak tree. He gave me a somber nod and glanced at Cassandra. "He's in room 402, Silas said, his voice dropping to a low rumble. "It wasn't a random altercation. It seems the people he owed money to, the ones you faced at Mercer Plaza, Eleanor, they have long reach. They found him in the transport van. He's stable, but he's unrecognizable." We walked toward the room. Through the glass partition, I saw a figure buried under a mountain of gauze and tubes. Mark, the man who had strutted through my house like he owned the foundation it was built upon, was now a broken assembly of skin and bone. His eyes were swollen shut, and the constant beep of the heart monitor was the only sign that the soul within was still fighting to stay in its shattered vessel. Cassandra stopped at the doorway. Her breath hitched. I felt a pang of maternal instinct, not for Mark, but for the pain my daughter was feeling as she witnessed the ultimate end of the man she had sacrificed her integrity for. "I can't go in there, Mom," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You don't have to," I said, placing a firm hand on her shoulder. "But you need to look. You need to see that this is the destination of the road he chose. This isn't just a hospital bed, Cassandra. This is the final invoice for a life of theft." I stepped into the room alone. The nurse looked up, checked my ID, and moved aside. I stood by the bed, looking down at my son-in-law. I felt no pity. I felt no anger. I felt a strange, cold clarity. Mark had seen us as liquid, as things to be spent and discarded. Now he was the one being drained by machines. Suddenly, the heart monitor began to spike. Mark's hand, bruised and swollen, twitched on the white sheet. His eyes didn't open, but his mouth moved, a dry, raspy sound that barely resembled a human voice. "Eleanor," he wheezed. I leaned down, my face inches from his. "I'm here, Mark. The money." He coughed, a thin trail of blood appearing at the corner of his mouth. "I know, Arthur. Where is it? I can make it right, just give me a chance." Even at the edge of the abyss, even with his body failing him, he was still chasing the ghost of the Vance wealth. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He wasn't asking about Cassandra. He was still calculating. "The money is where it belongs, Mark," I said, my voice as steady as a surgeon's blade. "It's building a home for people you would have stepped over on the street. It's paying for the bus fare of the woman who used to be your wife. You will never touch a single cent of it. And when you close your eyes for the last time, you will do so knowing that the old woman you tried to ruin is the one who will decide whether you're buried in a marked grave or a potter's field." His monitor flatlined for an agonizing 3 seconds before the machines forced his heart back into rhythm. He didn't speak again. He drifted back into the gray fog of his coma, a man who had won the world but lost his soul. I walked out of the room. Silas was waiting with a clipboard. He signed a power of attorney over to a business associate 3 days ago, Eleanor. They're trying to move against the trust again. Even from a cell, he was trying to bleed you dry. "Then we cut the vein, Silas," I said. "I want every legal tie Mark Sterling has to the Vance name severed tonight. I want the divorce papers finalized under extraordinary circumstances. And I want those associates of his to know that if they so much as whisper the name Vance again, I will release the forensic files Arthur kept on their offshore accounts." Silas raised an eyebrow. "Arthur kept files on them, too." "Arthur kept files on everyone, Silas. He didn't just collect books, he collected leverage. He knew that one day I would be the one holding the deck." We left the hospital as the first hint of dawn began to crack the horizon. Cassandra was silent until we reached the car. She looked at the hospital building, a looming shadow against the morning light. "He asked about the money, didn't he?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "He didn't ask about me." "No, honey, he didn't." Cassandra took a deep breath, and I saw something shift in her expression, a final hardening of her resolve. She pulled a small notebook from her bag, the one she had been using to track the properties we were converting for the foundation. "Good," she said, her voice stronger than I'd ever heard it. "Because I have a meeting at 8 o'clock with the city council. We need to finalize the zoning for the Mercer Plaza Community Center. I don't have time for ghosts." The transformation of Cassandra was not a miracle. It was a slow, painful construction. Over the next month, she worked with a fervor that bordered on obsession. She was the first one at the office and the last to leave. She handled the angry phone calls from Mark's creditors with a cool professionalism that made even Silas Thorne tip his hat to her. She wasn't just my daughter anymore. She was becoming my partner. We spent our weekends at the lake house, but not as we had before. We didn't sit in silence. We worked on the garden Arthur had loved. We replanted the roses, we fixed the fence, and we talked about the future. I watched her hands grow calloused and her skin tan under the sun. The princess was gone, replaced by a woman who knew the value of the dirt beneath her fingernails. But as the community center neared its grand opening, a new shadow appeared. A man named Julian Vane, no relation, though the name was a strange coincidence, started showing up at our construction sites. He was a developer, a man with a smile that didn't reach his eyes and a portfolio of glass towers that were slowly suffocating the soul of the city. He arrived at my house one evening, unannounced, carrying a bottle of vintage wine that probably cost more than my first house. "Mrs. Vance," he said, stepping into the foyer with an air of practiced elegance. "I've been following your work with the foundation. It's very noble. But let's be honest. Mercer Plaza is prime real estate. Putting a senior center there is like putting a playground in the middle of Wall Street. I'm here to offer you a way out. a buyout that would triple your husband's initial investment. I looked at the wine, then at the man. He reminded me of a more refined version of Mark, the same hunger, the same belief that everything had a price. My husband's investment wasn't just financial, Mr. Vane, I said, leading him into the kitchen. I didn't offer him a chair. It was emotional. That building isn't for sale, not for triple, not for 10 times the value. Everyone has a price, Alina, he said, his voice dropping to a persuasive hum. Think of what you could do for your daughter with that kind of money. I hear she's been struggling, working in a diner, taking the bus. You could give her the life she deserves. I felt a cold smile touch my lips. My daughter finally has the life she deserves, Mr. Vane. She has a life built on her own merit. And as for my price, you couldn't afford it because the currency I deal in doesn't fit in your bank. Just then, Cassandra walked in. She was wearing her work boots and a high-visibility vest, her face smudged with dust from the site. She saw Julian and froze. Mr. Vane, what are you doing in my mother's house? Just offering some friendly advice, Cassandra, Julian said, his eyes scanning her disheveled appearance with a flicker of disdain. Cassandra walked over to the table, picked up Julian's expensive bottle of wine, and handed it back to him. We don't drink this kind of wine, Julian. It tastes too much like greed, and if you're here about the Mercer Plaza site, you can save your breath. We just signed the non-alienation clause. The land is legally tied to the foundation for the next 99 years. Even if we wanted to sell it, which we don't, we can't. Julian's face hardened. The mask of elegance slipped for a fraction of a second, revealing a man who didn't like to lose. You're making a mistake, both of you. This city is changing. You can either be the ones holding the shovel or the ones buried by it. We'll take our chances with the shovel, I said, pointing toward the door. When he left, the house felt cleaner. Cassandra collapsed into a chair and laughed, a genuine, hearty laugh that filled the kitchen. He's been hounding me at the site for weeks, Mom. I didn't want to tell you because I wanted to handle it myself. You did handle it, Cassandra, I said, pride swelling in my chest. You handled it perfectly. But as we sat there, the laughter faded into a quiet, reflective moment. We were winning the war, but I knew that the world was full of men like Julian and Mark. The Vance fortune was a target, and as long as we held it, we would never be truly at peace. Mom, Cassandra said suddenly. Do you think Dad knew it would be this hard? Do you think he knew that the money would bring so many sharks? I think that's why he kept it a secret as long as he could, I replied. He wanted us to be strong enough to bite back. And I think he'd be very proud of your teeth, Cassandra. That night, I went back to box 247 in my mind. I thought of the locket, the journal, and the empty space in the box. I realized then that the treasure wasn't the properties or the gold. The treasure was the time we were spending now, rebuilding a bridge that had been burned to the ground. But there was one final document in the back of the ledger that I hadn't shown Cassandra yet, a document that Arthur had titled the final contingency. It was a list of names, people in the city, high-ranking officials and low-level informants who owed Arthur Vance favors. As I looked at the list, I saw a name that made my blood run cold. Julian Vane. It seemed the man who had just tried to buy our soul was the same man who had once been saved from ruin by my husband's silent hand. Julian didn't just want the property. He was trying to erase a debt of honor he never intended to pay. I picked up the phone and dialed Sela's. Sela's, it's Alina. We need to look at Julian Vane's history. It seems he and Arthur had a very interesting relationship 20 years ago, and I think it's time Julian was reminded of it. The game wasn't over. It was just moving to a higher level, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of the heights. The revelation that Julian Vane was not just a random corporate shark, but a man tied to Arthur's secret past, changed the atmosphere in the Vance house. The air felt charged, as if a storm were brewing just beyond the horizon. Sela's Thorne arrived at my home early the next morning, his leather briefcase bulging with files that had been pulled from the deepest, dustiest corners of his archives. We sat in the kitchen, the sunlight reflecting off the silver locket around Cassandra's neck as Sela's spread the documents across the scarred oak table. Arthur was a strategist, Alina, Silas began, his voice low and urgent. 20 years ago, Julian Vane was a mid-level developer who had gambled his entire firm on a high-rise project that was failing. He had cut corners, bribed inspectors, and was facing 20 years in prison and total bankruptcy. Arthur found out. He didn't go to the police. Instead, he bought Julian's debt anonymously through one of his shell companies. He essentially saved Vane's life, but he kept the proof of the bribes as collateral. Julian has spent 2 decades pretending to be a self-made titan, but he's been living on a foundation of blackmail and mercy. I looked at the black and white photos of a younger, panicked Julian Vane standing outside a courtroom. He didn't come here just to buy Mercer Plaza, did he, Silas? He came to see if I knew. He came to see if the files died with Arthur. Precisely, Silas nodded. And when he saw you and Cassandra weren't backing down, he realized he was still under the thumb of a dead man. Men like Julian don't handle that well. He's going to strike, Alina, not through a buyout, but through something much dirtier. Cassandra leaned forward, her eyes hard. Let him try, we have the proof. We can take this to the district attorney today. No, I said, my voice surprising even myself with its cold authority. If we go to the DA now, we lose the leverage. Julian has friends in high places. He'll bury the evidence before it reaches a judge. We need to lure him out. We need to make him think he's won, and then we pull the ground out from under him, just like he tried to do to me. The plan was set into motion that very afternoon. I called Julian Vane. I kept my voice shaky, the voice of a woman who was finally beginning to crack under the pressure. I told him I had reconsidered. I told him that the legal complexities of the foundation were becoming too much for a woman of my age, and that Cassandra was starting to regret her hardline stance. I invited him to a private dinner at the lake house on Friday night to discuss the terms of a quiet transfer. Julian's voice over the phone was a purr of triumph. I knew you were a sensible woman, Alina. Friday at 8, I'll bring the paperwork. The next few days were a blur of preparation. While Cassandra continued her work at the community center to maintain the illusion of normalcy, Silas and I worked with a private security team to wire the lake house. We weren't just looking for a confession, we were looking for a move. Silas's investigators had discovered that Julian had hired a fixer, a man whose job was to ensure that inconvenient documents disappeared. We knew that Julian wouldn't just bring a contract to the lake house. He would bring someone to find Arthur's hidden files. Friday arrived with a heavy, gray sky that mirrored the tension in my chest. I spent the afternoon at the lake house, arranging the furniture just as Arthur had liked it. I placed the leather-bound journal from box 247 on the coffee table, right where Julian couldn't miss it. It was the bait. At exactly 8:00 p.m., a silver Mercedes pulled into the gravel driveway. Julian stepped out, dressed in a sharp navy suit, looking every bit the victor. He was alone, or so it seemed. But through the security monitors hidden in the kitchen, I saw a second figure, a man in a dark hoodie, slip toward the back of the house, heading for Arthur's old study. "Alina," Julian said, stepping onto the deck with a wide, predatory smile. "A beautiful evening for a new beginning." "Come in, Julian," I said, my heart pounding but my face a mask of weary resignation. "Cassandra is in the city finishing up some paperwork. It's just us." We sat in the living room. I poured him a glass of wine, the expensive bottle he had brought to my house days ago. He took a sip, leaning back with an air of immense satisfaction. "I have the contract here," he said, tapping a leather folder. $20 million for the Mercer Plaza site and a generous retirement bonus for you. You can spend your remaining years in luxury, Alina. No more buses, no more diners for your daughter. I looked at the journal on the table. Julian's eyes followed my gaze. "Is that Arthur S.?" he asked, his voice tightening. "Yes," I whispered. "He kept everything in here, every investment, every secret. He spoke of you often in these pages, Julian. He spoke of a time 20 years ago when you were a different man." The smile vanished from Julian's face. He set his wine glass down with a sharp clack. "Arthur was a librarian who got lucky with some stocks, Alina. Let's not romanticize the past, the files he had. They're outdated, irrelevant. Are they? I asked. Because the auditor Silas Thorne hired seems to think they are very relevant to your current holding company. It seems your self-made empire is still legally tied to a debt that was never paid to the Vance Trust. If that journal and the documents in Arthur's study were to go public, you wouldn't just lose the building, Julian, you'd lose your liberty. Julian stood up, his face contorting with rage. I'm not a desperate kid anymore, Alina. You think you can blackmail me? I've already sent someone to take what belongs to me. By the time we finish this wine, there won't be a single piece of paper in this house that connects me to Arthur Vance. As if on cue, the back door burst open. The man in the hoodie stepped into the living room, holding a heavy metal box, Arthur's emergency safe from the study. Got it, boss, the man grunted. Julian turned to me, his eyes burning with a cruel light. You see, Alina, you were always too slow. You and Arthur playing at being noble. In this world, the one who takes wins. Now I'll take the journal and you'll sign the Mercer Plaza deed, or things will get very unpleasant for you and your daughter. I didn't move. I didn't scream. I simply picked up my wine glass and took a slow sip. You're right about one thing, Julian, I said, my voice echoing in the quiet room. In this world, the one who plans ahead wins. Cassandra, you can come out now. The lights in the hallway flickered on. Cassandra stepped out, but she wasn't alone. She was holding a tablet that showed a live stream of the entire conversation, recorded from 4 different angles. Behind her stood Silas Thorne and 2 officers from the state police. We have the confession, Julian, Cassandra said, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and triumph. We have you on camera admitting to the theft of the safe and the blackmail of a widow. And as for that safe. Silas stepped forward and tapped the metal box. It's empty, Julian. We moved the files to a secure vault 3 days ago. We just wanted to see how far you'd go to bury your past. Julian's face went from a triumphant red to a deathly ashen white. He looked at the officers, then at the camera, then back at me. The Titan was gone. In his place was the same panicked kid from 20 years ago. You set me up, he stammered. I didn't set you up, Julian, I said, standing up to face him. I just gave you the opportunity to be the man Arthur hoped you could become. You chose to be a thief instead, just like Mark. The officers moved in, cuffing Julian and his fixer. As they were led out to the squad cars, the silence of the lake house returned, but this time it felt lighter. The final ghost of Arthur's secret life had been exorcised. Cassandra collapsed onto the sofa, the tablet sliding from her lap. That was the most terrifying thing I've ever done, Mom. But you did it, I said, sitting beside her and taking her hand. You stood your ground. I did it for Dad, she whispered, and for you. I couldn't let him take the one thing we have left of him. The next morning, the news of Julian Vane's arrest hit the front pages. His empire began to crumble as the details of his past fraud and the attempted blackmail of Alina Vance came to light. The Mercer Plaza Community Center became a symbol of resistance against the greed that had nearly swallowed the city. But the real victory was in the small things. A week later, Cassandra and I were back at the lake house. We weren't hiding anymore. We were sitting on the deck, watching the silver Cadillac gleam in the sun. Mom, Cassandra said, looking at the silver locket around her neck. I've been thinking. The foundation is doing great, but we still have the penthouse at Riverside Heights. It's been empty since the eviction. What are you thinking, honey? I think we should turn it into a scholarship house, she said. For kids like I was, kids who have the drive but don't have the direction. We can give them a place to stay while they learn how to build something real. Not a world of glass towers, but a world of integrity. I looked at my daughter. I saw the girl who had once discarded me like garbage, now transformed into a woman who wanted to build a sanctuary for others. Arthur's plan had worked. The feast he had prepared wasn't the money, it was the woman standing in front of me. I think your father would love that, I said. Just then, the phone rang. It was the hospital again. Mark Sterling had passed away in his sleep. I looked at the water of the lake, feeling the final chord of the past snap. There was no more anger. There was no more debt. There was only the future. "Cassandra," I said, handing her the car keys, "why don't you drive?" I think it's time we went to the bank one last time, not to open a box, but to close a chapter. As the silver Cadillac roared to life, I leaned back and closed my eyes. I could almost hear Arthur's voice in the breeze, whispering those 3 words that had sustained me for 45 years. "Good morning, my love." And for the first time since he left, it truly was a good morning. The morning of Mark's funeral was as gray and somber as the life he had led. There were no crowds, no mourning colleagues, and no grieving friends. It was just Cassandra and me, standing under a black umbrella in a quiet corner of the municipal cemetery. I had paid for a simple headstone, not out of love, but out of respect for the man Cassandra had once believed he was. As the soil was shoveled over the casket, I watched my daughter. She didn't weep. She stood with her shoulders back, her gaze fixed on the horizon. She wasn't burying a husband. She was burying the last piece of her own weakness. "It's over, Mom," she said as we walked back to the Cadillac. "The debts, the lies, the fear, it's all under the ground now." "It's only over if you choose for it to be, Cassandra," I reminded her. "The world doesn't stop trying to take just because one man is gone, but you've learned how to hold on to what matters." We drove back to the city in silence, but it was a comfortable silence. The following week was a whirlwind of activity. With Julian Vane behind bars and Mark gone, the vultures that had been circling the Vance estate finally retreated into the shadows. Silas Thorne worked tirelessly to finalize the transition of the Riverside Heights Penthouse into the Arthur Vance Scholarship House. It was a massive undertaking, but Cassandra handled the logistics with a precision that made my heart swell with pride. She was no longer the girl who panicked at a bus stop. She was a woman who commanded respect in boardrooms and construction sites alike. She still took the bus occasionally, a self-imposed reminder of the month she spent washing dishes, but now she did it with a smile, knowing that her worth wasn't tied to the vehicle she drove. One afternoon, while I was at the Vance Foundation office, a woman walked in. She was young, perhaps in her early 20s, with tired eyes and a toddler clinging to her hip. She looked exactly the way I had felt on that plastic chair in the doctor's office, lost, discarded, and invisible. I heard this place helps people," she whispered, clutching a crumpled flyer for our senior housing program. "My mother, she was evicted. Her landlord sold the building to a developer and she has nowhere to go. I'm working 2 jobs, but I can't take her in. The shelters are full." I looked at the woman, and then I looked at Cassandra, who was standing in the doorway of her office. Without a word, Cassandra walked over and took the woman's hand. "Don't worry," Cassandra said softly. "We have a room for her at Mercer Plaza. And we're going to help you find a better job so you don't have to work too. My name is Cassandra. Tell me everything." I sat back in my chair, watching my daughter lead the woman into her office. In that moment, I realized that the remake of our lives was complete. The tragedy had been transformed into a mission. However, as the sun began to set over the city, Silas Thorne walked into my office. He looked troubled, his usual stoic expression replaced by a deep frown. He closed the door behind him and sat down, leaning forward with his hands clasped. "Eleanor, there's one more thing, something Arthur didn't put in the ledger or the safety deposit box." My heart skipped a beat. "What is it, Silas? I thought we were done with secrets." "I was doing a final sweep of Julian Vane's personal files after the police seized them," Silas said, pulling a single, yellowed photograph from his pocket. "I found this hidden in his desk. It's a photo of Arthur, taken 35 years ago, but he isn't in a library, Eleanor. He's standing in front of a government building in Washington, D.C., and he's wearing a uniform I don't recognize. I took the photo. Arthur looked young, vibrant, and incredibly serious. The uniform was dark, with no insignia or rank, but the way he stood, with a hand on the shoulder of a high-ranking general, suggested a level of influence I had never dreamed of. "Julian Vane wasn't just a developer Arthur saved," Silas whispered. Vane was part of a group that Arthur had been monitoring for decades, Arthur wasn't just a librarian who became a smart investor, Eleanor. He was an operative. The shell companies and trusts weren't just for tax purposes. They were part of a larger network designed to protect the city's infrastructure from people like Vane. I stared at the photo, the world tilting on its axis. My husband, the man who fixed clocks and made me toast every morning, had been a guardian of the city. He hadn't just built a wall for me, he had built a fortress for everyone. "Does Cassandra know?" I asked. "No, and I'm not sure she should," Silas replied. "But there's a ledger, Eleanor, a real one. Vane had been trying to find it for 20 years. That's why he wanted the lake house. He thought Arthur had hidden it there." "The lake house?" I whispered. I thought of the floorboards in the closet where Arthur had kept the first envelope. I thought of the garden, the porch, the old tree where Arthur used to park his truck. "If Vane couldn't find it, it's still there," I said, rising from my desk. "Silas, I need to go to the lake house. Alone. Eleanor, it might be dangerous. If Vane's associates think the ledger is still there." "I've spent 71 years being protected, Silas," I said, grabbing my coat. It's time I saw the truth for myself. I drove the Cadillac toward the coast, the engine humming a melody of secrets. The lake was dark when I arrived, the water reflecting the silver sliver of the moon. I walked into the house, the floorboards creaking under my feet. I went straight to Arthur's study. I had searched this room a dozen times, but now I looked at it with new eyes. I didn't look for documents. I looked for the man who fixed clocks. I looked at the large grandfather clock in the corner, the one Arthur had spent 3 years restoring. He used to say that time was the only thing you couldn't buy, only manage. I opened the glass door and felt along the inner casing. Nothing. I looked at the weights, the pendulum, and then I saw it, a small, almost invisible notch in the wood near the base. I pressed it. With a soft, mechanical click, a hidden compartment slid open. Inside was a small, black digital drive and a handwritten note. To my Eleanor. "If you found this, you've discovered that I was more than a librarian. Forgive me for the lie, but the truth was a burden I didn't want you to carry. This drive contains the evidence to dismantle every corrupt firm in this state. It is the final feast. But remember, my love, power is like a clock. If you don't wind it with integrity, it eventually stops. Use this only if the foundation isn't enough. Love, Arthur." I held the drive in my hand, feeling its cold, metallic weight. I could change the world with this. I could destroy Julian Vane's entire network, expose every politician Mark had ever bribed, and turn the Vance name into the most powerful force in the country. But then I thought of Cassandra. I thought of her washing dishes. I thought of her taking the bus. I thought of the way she looked when she helped that woman in the office today. She had found her soul through struggle, not through power. If I gave her this, would I be giving her a gift, or would I be handing her the same poison that had destroyed Mark? I walked out onto the deck and looked at the lake. The water was deep and silent, a mirror of the man I had loved for 45 years. Arthur had given me a choice. He had given me the final feast, but he had also given me the strength to say no. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the drive. I looked at it for a long time, the moonlight glinting off its surface. Then, with a flick of my wrist, I tossed it into the dark, cold depths of the lake. The splash was tiny, almost silent. The secrets of Arthur Vance were now at the bottom of the water where they could never hurt anyone again. We didn't need a final feast of destruction. We had the foundation. We had the lake house. We had each other. I went back inside and called Cassandra. "Mom." "Is everything okay? Silas said you went to the lake." "Everything is perfect, honey," I said, my voice filled with a peace I hadn't felt in a lifetime. "I just wanted to say good night, and tomorrow I want you to come to the lake house. We're going to plant those new roses. The garden needs a fresh start." "I'll be there, Mom, at dawn." I hung up and sat in Arthur's chair. The house was quiet, but it didn't feel empty anymore. It felt full of memories, of lessons, and of a future that we were building with our own hands. I looked at the grandfather clock. It was ticking, steady and true. The poor widow had become a queen, but the queen had chosen to be a mother. And as I closed my eyes, I knew that Arthur was finally at rest. The following morning, the sun broke over the lake in a kaleidoscope of gold and crimson, chasing away the lingering shadows of Arthur's secrets. I was already on the porch, a mug of coffee warming my hands, when the silver Cadillac crunched over the gravel. Cassandra stepped out, dressed in worn denim and a flannel shirt, her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She didn't look like the woman who had once obsessed over European fashion. She looked like someone ready to dig into the earth. "You're up early, Mom," she said, stepping onto the deck and breathing in the crisp morning air. "Silas called me late last night," he seemed. "Worried about you. He said you were looking for something." I looked out at the spot in the lake where the digital drive now lay, buried in the silt and silence of the deep water. "I was looking for a ghost, Cassandra, but I found something else instead." I found the realization that we don't need to know every secret our loved ones kept. We just need to honor the life they built for us. Cassandra sat beside me, her eyes searching mine. "Did you find what Dad was hiding?" "I found a choice," I said softly, reaching out to pat her hand. "And I chose us. I chose the garden, the foundation, and the life we're making now. Some things are better left to the depths." We spent the next 6 hours in the garden. We worked in a rhythmic, comfortable harmony that required no words. We cleared the weeds that had choked Arthur's rose bushes during the months of our grief and betrayal. We turned the soil, adding fresh compost, and carefully planted the new bushes we had bought from the local nursery. As I watched Cassandra work, her brow damp with sweat, her hands stained with the dark, rich earth, I realized that this was the real inheritance. Not the millions in the bank, not the commercial buildings downtown, but this shared labor. This was the restoration of our bond. Around noon, we took a break, sitting on the porch steps and sharing a pitcher of lemonade. The phone rang inside, and for a moment, I felt a flicker of the old anxiety. But when I checked the screen, it was Aurora, my neighbor from the city. "Eleanor." "I'm so sorry to bother you at the lake," Aurora's voice chirped with its usual mix of curiosity and concern. "But there's a man at your front door in the city. He says he's a representative from a national humanitarian organization. He's asking for the director of the Vance Trust." I told him you were a poor widow, but he just smiled and said he knew exactly who you were. I looked at Cassandra and smiled. The world was beginning to recognize the work we were doing. "Thank you, Aurora. Tell him I'll be back in the city tomorrow. And Aurora, you can stop bringing over those casseroles. I think I've finally found my footing." After I hung up, Cassandra looked at me with a smirk. "A humanitarian organization? Are we going national, Mom?" "The Vance Foundation was never meant to be just a local project, Cassandra. Your father built a fortress, but I think he wanted us to build a city. If we can do this here, we can do it anywhere." There are thousands of Eleanors out there who have been discarded by their families. They need a place where they aren't just invisible. The rest of the afternoon was spent walking the perimeter of the property. We talked about expanding the lake house, not for luxury, but to turn it into a retreat for the women in our program, a place where they could come to find the same peace we had found. Cassandra took notes in her little book, her mind already calculating the costs and the zoning requirements. She had become a master of the very liquidity she once craved, but now she viewed it as a means to an end, not the end itself. As the sun began to dip, casting long, violet shadows across the lawn, a black sedan pulled into the driveway. My heart didn't race this time. I knew the car. It was Silas. He stepped out, looking more relaxed than I had seen him in months. He was carrying a small wooden box. "I thought you might want this," Silas said, joining us on the porch. "I was clearing out Arthur's private locker at the firm, the one he used for his librarian work. I found this tucked away in the back." I opened the box. Inside was a collection of old, tarnished keys, each one labeled with a name and a date. Some were decades old. I recognized the names of some of the city's oldest families and some of its most notorious characters. "These are keys to the city, Eleanor," Silas said quietly. In the literal sense, Arthur had access to the service tunnels, the old archives, the hidden rooms in the city hall. He was the keeper of the keys. I ran my fingers over the cold metal. He was the keeper of the truth, Silas. But the truth is a heavy thing to carry alone. He wasn't alone, Silas said, looking at Cassandra. He was waiting for his team to be ready, and I think he'd say you're more than ready. That evening, we made a fire in the hearth. The three of us sat together, talking about the man who had orchestrated this entire journey from beyond the grave. We laughed about Arthur's stubbornness, his quiet jokes, and the way he could fix anything with a piece of wire and a bit of patience. The betrayal that had started this journey, Cassandra's cold phone call from the doctor's office, felt like a lifetime ago. It was a scar, yes, but a scar is just a place where the skin grew back stronger. Before Silas left, he pulled me aside. Julian Vane's lawyers are trying to strike a deal, Alina. They're offering to turn over his remaining assets to the Vance Foundation in exchange for a reduced sentence. He's terrified of what else might be on that drive he thinks you have. I looked out at the lake, the dark water hiding the secret I had discarded. Tell them we'll take the assets, but no deals on the sentence. Julian Vane needs to spend a long time thinking about the difference between a price and a value. And the drive. Silas asked, his eyes narrowing. The drive is gone, Silas. It's part of the lake now. The only evidence we need is the work we do every day. Silas nodded, a look of profound respect in his eyes. Arthur was right about you, Alina. You were always the smarter one. When everyone had gone to bed, I stayed up for a while, sitting by the dying embers of the fire. I felt a sense of completion that was almost overwhelming. I had lost a husband and gained a daughter. I had lost a home and gained an empire of hope. I had been discarded like garbage and had risen as a queen of my own destiny. I picked up Arthur's leather-bound journal and turned to the very last page. I had seen the entries about Cassandra, the warnings about Mark, and the instructions for the foundation. But there was one final note, written in a shaky hand, likely just hours before he died. Alina, my love. If you are reading this, know that my greatest investment was never a building or a stock. It was the 45 years I spent across the table from you. I knew you'd find the way. I knew you'd bring our girl home. The keys were always in your hands, Alina. I was just the librarian holding the map. I love you, always. I closed the journal and held it to my chest, a single tear escaping and disappearing into the wine-colored fabric of my dress. I wasn't just Alina Vance, the widow. I was Alina Vance, the architect of a new legacy. Tomorrow, we would go back to the city. We would face the humanitarians, the developers, and the thousands of people who needed us. We would build the scholarship house, we would expand the foundation, and we would keep planting roses. But tonight, I just wanted to be Arthur's wife. I stood up, blew out the final candle, and walked up the stairs. The house was full of shadows, but they didn't scare me anymore. They were the shadows of a life well lived, a life that was only just beginning its second act. As I lay in bed, the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock from the hallway lulled me towards sleep. It was a sound of perfect, unyielding time, a reminder that while we cannot change the past, we have every second of the future to make it right. The morning of the grand opening for the Arthur Vance Scholarship House arrived with a sky so blue it felt like a promise kept. The Riverside Heights penthouse, once a symbol of Cassandra's hollow vanity and Mark's stolen dreams, had been completely transformed. The marble floors remained, but they were now covered in warm rugs. The cold glass walls were softened by bookshelves filled with the very literature Arthur had spent his life protecting. This was no longer a monument to ego, it was a lighthouse. I stood in the center of the room, wearing the same wine-colored dress I had worn to Silas's office on the day I decided to fight back. Beside me stood Cassandra. She looked radiant, not because of expensive jewelry, but because of the sheer light of purpose in her eyes. She was greeting the first 10 recipients of our scholarship, young men and women who had faced the same abandonment and poverty she had once tried to inflict on me. "Mom, look at them," she whispered, leaning toward me. "They have so much hope." I can't believe I almost threw away the chance to be a part of this. "You didn't throw it away, Cassandra," I said, squeezing her hand. "You just had to take the long way around to find it." The ceremony was simple. There were no long-winded speeches from politicians or hollow praise from developers. I stepped up to the small podium, looking out at the crowd. I saw Sila's Thorn in the front row, wiping his glasses with a handkerchief. I saw Aurora, who had traveled from our neighborhood, looking on with wide, astonished eyes. And I saw the ghosts of our past, Mark and Julian, fading into the insignificance they deserved. My husband, Arthur Vance, believed that time was the only currency that truly mattered, I began, my voice clear and steady. He spent his time building a world in secret so that when the people he loved were lost, they would have a map to find their way home. This house is not a gift from the Vance family. It is a debt of honor. It is a reminder that no one is ever truly liquidated, as long as there is someone willing to stand up and say, "You matter." My daughter and I were lost, but today we are home. As the ribbon was cut and the house was officially opened, the room filled with the sounds of laughter and conversation. I slipped away for a moment, walking out onto the balcony that overlooked the city. From this height, the streets looked like a complex clockwork, 1,000 lives moving in rhythmic patterns. I thought about the digital drive at the bottom of the lake. I thought about the keys in the wooden box. I realized that the real power Arthur had left me wasn't the ability to destroy our enemies. It was the ability to ignore them and focus on the light. Cassandra joined me on the balcony, leaning against the railing. "What are you thinking about, Mom?" "I'm thinking about that morning in the doctor's office," I said. "The moment you hung up on me, I remember sitting on that green plastic chair, feeling like the world had ended. I want to thank you for that phone call, Cassandra." She looked at me, startled. "Thank me." "Mom, that was the most horrible thing I've ever done." "It was," I agreed with a smile. "But it was also the moment I woke up. If you hadn't pushed me off that cliff, I never would have realized I had wings. I would have spent the rest of my life as a quiet widow, never knowing the strength Arthur saw in me. You gave me back my life by trying to take it." Cassandra hugged me then, a long, tight embrace that smelled of roses and the fresh start we had planted together. "I love you, Mom. I don't deserve you, but I'll spend the rest of my life trying to." "You already do, honey. You already do." As the sun began to set, casting a golden bridge across the city skyline, we walked back inside to join the celebration. The Vance Trust was thriving, the foundation was growing, and the lake house was waiting for us. We were no longer victims of the past. We were the architects of the future. That night, back at our suburban home, I sat in the kitchen with a cup of tea. The house was quiet, but it was a warm, living silence. I looked at the family photo on the wall, the one of 5-year-old Cassandra on Arthur's lap. I realized that the little girl hadn't gone anywhere. She had just been waiting for her mother to become the woman who could lead her back. I picked up my phone and saw a notification. The national organization Aurora had mentioned was ready to partner with us on 3 new locations. The Vance name was no longer a secret. It was a movement. I smiled, thinking of Arthur pouring orange juice and fixing clocks. He had been a librarian of human souls, and he had saved the 2 most important ones just in time. I walked to the hallway and stood before the grandfather clock. I reached out and gently touched the wood where the hidden compartment had been. I didn't need the drive. I didn't need the blackmail. I had everything I needed right here. "Good night, Arthur," I whispered. The clock ticked once, a resonant metallic heartbeat that echoed through the house. It was 10:00 p.m. The day was done, the lesson was learned, and the legacy was secure. Eleanor Vance, the woman who had been discarded like garbage, was finally, truly, rich. Not in gold, not in deeds, but in the unconditional, hard-won love of a daughter who had finally found her way home. The bus still runs past the corner of my street every morning, and sometimes, when I see it, I remember the woman who sat on the bench with her world in ashes. I wish I could tell her that the fire wouldn't destroy her, it would only temper the steel of her soul. But she knows now. We both know. The story of the Vances wasn't a tragedy of betrayal. It was a masterpiece of redemption, written in the ink of sacrifice and the blood of a mother's heart. And as I turned off the kitchen light and walked up the stairs, I knew that the best chapters were still yet to be written. The end of the day had come, but for us, it was only the beginning of forever.